Hey guys, Brandon here, and as I said in the end of the last podcast, today we'll be talking about something called redshift and blueshift. Now, this sounds pretty obvious, but you have to kind of get more of the background theory and just get a stronger understanding of what this actually is and how it's in any way relevant. As you can guess, this is having to do with light shifting towards either the blue end of the spectrum or the red end of the spectrum. Now, some of you are probably sitting there staring at me saying, what does that even mean? Well, when you look at light, the visible light that we interact with every day, it actually falls kind of in the middle of the spectrum of all light that is known. This includes X-rays, microwaves, ultraviolet, infrared. And I specifically mentioned those two last because those are really the two spectrums that we see in. Everything on the blue ends, we'll make that over here if I can make my hands line up with the camera, that falls into kind of the ultraviolet, which is your shorter wavelengths and higher energies. And then as you move across, you fall through right in the middle. That's kind of where you get your greens. And then you move into the yellows, oranges, reds. And then in the red, that's when you start hitting the infrared end of the spectrum. And you get into the longer wavelengths, lower energies, and it moves on into the microwaves and X-rays that we use to take pictures of our bones and see what happened after we fell off our skateboard. But what happens with the red shift and the blue shift is because you do have to worry about the wavelength. The closest analogy that most people tend to think of is the sound of a car passing by, especially when you're at the NASCAR or you're watching that on TV and you hear them go zipping by. It kind of has that and you can hear how it goes from higher to lower. And that happens because when the car is moving towards you, as any object with light that's emitting light towards you, those waves are getting pressed together because they're being released at the same amount of time, that same frequency, but the object is getting closer and closer to you, which means those waves are going to be hitting you a lot faster. That will give you that higher frequency, which you will hear in the sound of the vehicle, which gives you that higher pitch, but then that also happens with light. So you'll get those shorter wavelengths, which will bring you more over towards that blue end of the spectrum. But then when you flip it over and you have that NASCAR heading away from you, now the source of those waves is getting further and further apart, which means the time between when the waves hit you is going to be further and further apart, which gives you that lower kind of bass sound, and that also with light brings you further and further over to that red end of the spectrum because now the waves are further and further apart, essentially making a longer wavelength. So that kind of gives you that little red shift versus blue shift. Now, we all have heard of Hubble, the scientist who kind of started the whole theory of what we know as our expanding universe, and which led into the discovery of dark energy, which I won't cover too much right now. But imagine his surprise when they launched their telescopes, they set up everything, they start taking pictures, and when they look at distant galaxy clusters, not just galaxies that are closest to us, but different clusters of galaxies that are millions and millions of parsecs away, they notice something rather peculiar, that every single cluster was, or essentially almost every single cluster, was redshifted, which means that these galaxies and these galaxy clusters are moving further away from us. And it's not just kind of a randomized, oh, some are moving away, some are moving towards us. It's kind of just a random blob. But it almost seems centralized, but in a completely different sense. In that, essentially, you think of it as you take bread dough and you throw a bunch of raisins in it. When that dough rises and expands, all the raisins expand away from each other. So if I'm standing at one of those raisins or our particular galaxy, it looks like everything else is expanding away from us. But if I were to go millions of parsecs away and stand on another galaxy or a few inches over on another one of those raisins, I'll get that exact same effect where it seems like everything is expanding away from me. That's kind of freaky if you think about it, because up until that point, we really didn't ever think that would ever happen. It's kind of one of those discoveries that happens within physics that you just don't expect. It's something that kind of blindsided a lot of people and is one of the largest theories being worked on right now. It's something pretty cool to think about that, you can make this discovery. And in the next podcast, I will actually be talking about the most recent update with that in an article that I found online. Because obviously we're getting better technology every single day, every single minute, pretty much, and we're able to make much more advances on those theories that we're talking about. So just kind of try to wrap your head around that right now. The idea that we had this, everything was just kind of there, and now we suddenly have this just explosion of, oh my God, everything's moving away, and it's like uniform throughout everywhere. It's the exact same no matter where you are. So it's one of those things that kind of links everything together, and it's, as I said before, one of the major theories that's being explored right now. So again, in the final podcast that we have, I will be discussing an article that I recently read about the newest update, and this just kind of gives you an idea of why we study what we do, why all these things I've been talking about in the previous podcast actually has some sort of physical meaning, and why it actually matters that we study what we do.